Hello, everybody. Nick the Tiro here. Let's talk about authentication factors. Now, I know most of you are well familiar with a lot of these factors. I'm not going to spend a lot of time drilling down deep into them, but I'm more concerned with the strengths and the weaknesses associated with them. So it should be a fairly quick video. Let's go up to the screen. I'm going to use the book as basically as a PowerPoint slide. All right. So we have a couple methods that to prove who we are, what they call authentication factors, and that's what it is. Remember, if you walk up to a bank's ATM machine, you're making that giant assumption that you have an account at that machine. Therefore, you are identifying yourself probably with a card. When we go to a computer, we identify ourselves with a username. How do we authenticate? What is the factors that associate with that? Well, we have a couple. We have knowledge factor, possession factor, inheritance factor, location factor, and behavior factor. Let's really break those down. The one that most of us are well familiar with is knowledge factors. Those are your passwords, your PINs, and things like that. Now, the nice thing about those is we make them up. We don't have to share them. They're not reliant upon somebody else giving it to us. They might have a default password. They have been tried and true for 60 years. The problem now is that we have so many accounts at our disposal. For example, me personally, I have around 200 different accounts that I use. I obviously have my Lakeland account and some ones that I use all the time, but I have over 200 accounts going all over the place. So a lot of times we cheat. We may use the same password or the same passcode over and over and over again. There was a famous hacking incident in the 2008 presidential election. Vice President nominee was Sarah Palin. She had her email hacked. And all they basically did was they figured out her past. They looked up some of her old history. So when they were beginning to ask knowledge-based questions, where did you go to high school? Or what street did you grow up on? The hacker was able to discover that just by looking stuff up. So a lot of times we rely on very simple things to be passwords. And even though we try to complicate them, it's always a question of memorization. Or we have to rely upon some kind of password vault, or worse yet, writing stuff down. Possession factors, something you have. Now, these can be very sophisticated. There'll be chips and circuitry and stuff like that, the encryption level on those are enormous. 256, 512, where nobody with the most powerful computers out there can crack through some of the methods to get that. The problem with that is we have to hold on to them, right? They're physical, they're tangible. We keep them in our wallet. We lose them, we're done. In some situations, in some extreme situations, you lose that card, your data is useless because of the way that things get encrypted, because they basically may encrypt everything based upon the chip on the card. So we have to be very careful about physically losing that possession. But I will tell you, of all the different technologies here, personal opinion, possession factor, the technology involved that is probably the most secure when it comes to accessing your particular data. Inheritance factor, who you are, right? Something you are. Your fingerprint, your retinal scan, your voice, DNA tracking. Now, this technology has been out for decades. 60s and 70s, they were doing fingerprint identifications and stuff like that. Maybe not the 60s, but 70s, 80s, absolutely. The problem with this technology is you have to give up a piece of your privacy. If you want to use your thumb as your identification, somewhere in the system, your thumb, the print on your thumb has to be digitized. Now, not the exact print, there's ways that they do it, but your thumb has to be given, the print has to be given away. Now, in a private organization, happens all the time. There's a lot of organizations, if you want to work for them, you got to do retina scan, voice recognition, thumbprint, but that's a private organization. We can do it tomorrow with American Express, MasterCard, Visa, all the big time credit cards. But are you willing to give up that much privacy? Are you willing to give up your DNA to MasterCard? Are you willing to give up your thumbprint and all the other stuff? So when you're dealing with an organization, you're probably dealing with maybe tens of thousands, or even big organizations, or even could be a much smaller number than that. You're dealing with MasterCard or Visa, God bless them. you're dealing with millions of potential points of compromise. So you do see a lot of inherence factors in private organizations, but when we get into much bigger things, there's just way too much privacy to give up. A location factor is you have to be somewhere physical to have access to a particular system. I always think of the very first Mission Impossible, where he's coming down in the ceiling with all the wires, and well, that's kind of Hollywood and that's extreme. But there are a lot of organizations. I worked at an organization that you did not have access to particular material unless you were physically at that location. They did not allow dial-in. They didn't allow any kind of VPN, and it wasn't a high secure place. We just basically did work for police and fire departments. But the police and fire departments did not want any kind of remote access. So if we wanted access to our stuff, we had to physically be there. And then behavior factors. I've seen them in action, but they're basically a knowledge factor that you kind of control. For example, it could be they have you touch some pads, and they can determine based who you are and what pad and how long it takes for you to find the pad. They can determine who you are, and they're fairly sophisticated in that regard. There's not a lot of false positives or false negatives in that regard, but it's just another form of identifying you based upon who you are. Now, I made mention of the word false positives and false negatives. All of these techniques can have issues where, for example, if you're doing a retina scan, it can lead to what they call a false negative. Now, in a false negative, basically it doesn't identify you. You put your eyeball there, it scans it, and says you're not who you're supposed to be. And there's ways that we can improve that. The more dangerous thing is when we get into a false positive. In a false positive, what will happen is if somebody else uses their retina to get in, but it identifies it as you, or a thumbprint or something like that, where somebody else's identification is coming up as used, that's far more dangerous. So I really just want to touch base very, very quickly about these authentication factors because they are becoming a major concern in the cybersecurity world. All of us were asked to authenticate constantly. So for somebody like me, my username, there's only so many usernames that I can use. And here at Lakeland, we use your email address and stuff like that. And a lot of times, usernames are easily discovered, right? And in the ethical hacking course, we do email scraping where we get email addresses because we assume a lot of companies just say, okay, your email address is your username. And we see that more and more. Google, if you have a Google thing. So we have to rely more upon the authentication factors like the passwords and things like that. So those have to be more sophisticated and improved. So that being said, let's use this stuff and let's go learn something.